Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
Hello, Dave.
It's going well, Matt. Had a good Father's Day here in Colorado.
Great.
3 of the 5 children were here.
Nice.
So, all good. Into summer, first day of summer yesterday, and getting ready, of course, for a wedding a week from Friday. So,
Yeah.
a lot of things going on in the Corbin household. Never mind that we're moving closer and closer toward the celebration of the Declaration of Independence, 250 years. So, which has been our show.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're almost there. We've made it, at least in terms of the sequence of documents, to the Declaration of Independence today. And we're recording on Monday, June 22nd. So we've got a little bit of time before we get to July 4th, but probably figured it wasn't going to be a good idea to try to combine a wedding and a, a podcast episode the same week. So good to get this one in the tank, and we'll publish it a little bit early so people can be all ready for 4th of July. And of course, the most important thing at the end of the show, stay tuned, because we're going to make our Joey Chestnut picks for the hot dog eating contest, which is really, along with, my mom makes a great flag cake, and we've got a few other traditions, but the hot dog eating contest is right up there in terms of 4th of July celebration.
What is a flag cake? Is that like a Pennsylvania pound cake or something like that? Or
It's kind of a pound cake with some whipped cream on top, and then we've got strawberries for the red and blueberries for the blue. And the kids lay it all out, and they got to get the 50 stars in there. So it's a pretty elaborate process, but it's a long-standing Parks family tradition out at the lake. So I'm looking forward to that.
Sounds excellent.
Yeah, it's good. It's good stuff. All right, well, let's jump into a little bit of our historical narrative here. So just last week, we were looking at the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And you remember the context there starts in the middle of May, when the Virginia Revolutionary Convention instructs the delegates from Virginia to the Second Continental Congress to make a motion for independence. So that was the move there. As we said last time, they're really there as ambassadors, essentially, on behalf of their colony or state, emerging state. And so because of that, if you're a delegate, you can't just vote your conscience. You have to vote according to the instructions that you've been given. And so it was a formal act on the part of this Revolutionary Convention to say, okay, now our instructions are independence, not just to support the war, which has been going on for 14 months at this point or so, but now actually formally declare independence. And so in response to that, as we mentioned briefly last time, Richard Henry Lee, one of the leading figures of revolutionary Virginia, moves in the Second Continental Congress that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that shows up in the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. So this is really the kernel of the Declaration. So that was June 7th, 1776. Before that resolution is approved, they want a statement that would accompany it. That leads to the creation of the committee that composes the Declaration of Independence. Of course, we know Thomas Jefferson as the lead author there. 2 other committees that were established at the same time. One was to create a model treaty for diplomatic relations, the idea being that we want to be able to, as an independent country, attract allies. And of course, that was used in negotiations with France and Spain, who became our principal allies during the war. And then also for establishing some kind of national frame of government, which eventually becomes the Articles of Confederation, although it takes a couple of years before that's all sorted out. So all this is happening at the committee level. finally, beginning of July, we have the resolution which comes to the floor. July 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress approves Lee's resolution. And so that's really, and we said this before, that's Independence Day. That's the day that the United States says we are no longer attached to the British Empire. We're able to negotiate treaties with other countries and do all other things that independent countries can do. But that's really the beginning of this process that then leads to the formal approval of the Declaration of Independence. And so for 2 days, they wordsmith it a little bit, make some modifications here, modifications there. And so finally on July 4th, we have Declaration of Independence Day. And I think it's worth thinking about the significance of the fact that we celebrate the document more than the mere fact of independence. And we'll have a chance to maybe talk about that as we go along.
It's interesting, Matt, that when they do this, they form three committees. One is, as you've noted, to compose a declaration. The second, to compose a model treaty for diplomatic relations. And then the third, to compose an Articles of Confederation. So here, declaring independence, the document itself, as you mentioned. Secondly, the very operational necessity to think of how we're going to relate with other nations. And then thirdly, how are we internally going to organize ourselves in a governmental form? And this has been a question that's come up over and over again as we move closer and closer to the Declaration. It's one thing to declare your independence from a regime. It's another to establish a regime of your own.
Hmm.
And if we were to say from now until 2037, continue to march along this 250-year celebration of events that take place in this 11-year period. There's a lot that goes into forming a government above and beyond declaring one's independence, and to what degree are the principles that lead to the Declaration, how are they embodied in the new governmental form, and what are some additional measures that are put forward in that governmental form, as it goes from being an Articles of Confederation to being, of course, under the American Constitution, a federal republic.
Sounds like you got an extra 11 years of podcasts all planned out there.
That's exactly.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, this is really the beginning of a process, and the Articles of Confederation will be a failure. A failure, I would say, not just in terms of practical terms. That's kind of the way we normally tell that story, but also philosophically. John Quincy Adams, I think, makes a very convincing case in a speech he gave on the 50th anniversary of Washington's inauguration that there was no connection ultimately between the principles of the Articles and the principles of the Declaration. And the reason he argues that is that the Articles of Confederation are based on the principle of state sovereignty, and the
Yeah.
Declaration is based on the principle of popular sovereignty, of the people being the final authority when it comes to framing the government, not popular sovereignty Stephen Douglas style, but popular sovereignty 1776 style. So that's, I think, something we can talk about as we work our way through these principles and see how it's rooted in human nature rather than the assertion of state power that we find the authority and the legitimacy of the government that's being imagined in the Declaration.
Well, I think another thing here that is, I think, important to mention is that the individuals, the signatories of the Declaration, the individuals who are involved over this 2 day period, they certainly recognize that they're doing something remarkable in human history.
Mm.
And here you have John Adams' letter to Abigail Adams, dated July 3rd, 1776, in which Adams writes to his wife, "The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I'm apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore." A ringing endorsement of how essential this movement in human history is, and what it will mean for the American people moving forward, and that they ought to celebrate it and realize that it is unique.
Yeah, I mean, he left out the hot dogs, and but we have the fireworks are there. Those illuminations are essentially the fireworks of that day. The thing that's obviously not so much a part of our celebrations today is the worship, right? And the Thanksgiving, given the acts of devotion to God Almighty that he talks about. So, we're thinking about, right, whether as we've secularized the holiday, have we lost something of our appreciation for what brought America to that point and what sustained the United States over the last 50 years?
It's a little bit like Father's Day, where the secularized version of it is, Dad, you can have whatever you want, and I'll be very kind to you today.
Right. Probably get
Losing
a
sight of the honoring one's parents, right? So
right,
anyway,
right. Yeah, good point. Well, as we get into the Declaration itself, when I was teaching this at King's, I would often tell students before we got into the substance of it, if you're looking for a model for an essay, you could do a lot worse than the Declaration of Independence. And I think it might be worthwhile before we get into it in specifics to just talk about the outline of the document. And so there's a very carefully designed ordering of the parts here that build an argument that's almost a deductive proof of a proposition. Obviously, in any formal argument, if the premises are true and the conclusion follows from the premises, then the argument has to be true. And that's kind of what we have in the Declaration of Independence. So we'll talk about the opening paragraph in just a moment, which gives the purpose of the document. It's kind of the introduction, the necessity, you might even say, of the document, as we'll see in the language there. Then the big meaty second paragraph has really three parts to it. The first part is the very famous principles we all know and love, self-evident truths, all men are created equal, etc. The middle section talks about limitations of those principles. So it begins with the word prudence, and it's kind of, but on the other hand, is kind of the framing in that part. And then the third section of that big second paragraph is an application of the principles to the circumstances. So in other words, here's theory, and here's why we're invoking this theory now. Here's why this is relevant to the American colonies in July of 1776. Now then from there, you get evidence. Okay, so you make a claim that we have a big problem with Britain, but now we need evidence to substantiate that. Just like any good essay, you have to have evidence to support your argument. And so we have the 18 grievances that we'll talk about a little bit. And of course, many of those at this point will be very, very familiar because we've walked through this history. And it's the story that we've been telling now for the last dozen episodes is a story that involves many of the laws and actions that are going to be invoked here as the reasons that impel them to the separation. Now then, the second to last section says basically we've met those conditions. The limitations on the principles don't apply in this case. So we understand that there are certain cases where those principles wouldn't apply, but that's not here. And then finally, the last paragraph, we have the necessary conclusion. Right? Okay, so here's the abstract theory, here's the specific application of it, here's the necessary consequence, which is, of course, independence. And so you can challenge the premises. You can say, well, I don't know if those grievances are substantial enough, but the logic of the argument is impeccable. Right? There's a direct flow from the initial principles all the way through to the end that leads you to the conclusion that if what's claimed here is correct, they have no choice but to declare independence.
And there's a certain application for teachers or parents listening to this episode about proper orientation to thinking and to arguing
Hmm.
that involves both an element of philosophy, of thinking through right principle, but also be cognizant of circumstances, of having kind of a historic sensibility as well. And I think there's a tendency in a lot of modern thought, a lot of modern philosophy to be void of a connection with reality. And likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of historic thought to not have or be disconnected from philosophic principle. So to apply both philosophy and history to a political question, I think is to act with a right orientation. And you see even debates within modern progressivism and modern conservatism to want to rule out one or the other. I think to the detriment of both progressivism and conservatism today.
That's a great observation. I think that's one thing that characterized our approach at King's when we taught American political thought and practice was a desire to be able to understand ideas in context, understand ideas in action, and to tell that story that was philosophically grounded and yet historically responsible. And so I think, that's something that, we think we've been committed to as scholars and teachers, and we can see that modeled for us here in the Declaration of Independence.
So let's get into the text of the Declaration of Independence. So the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, and these famous lines, one in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So here, kind of building upon the point that was just made, this is a declaration that is part of a course of human events. And that course of human events goes back to the beginning of human history. And the American colonials realize that they're part of that human history. But they also realize, right, that as you make any kind of political decision, there has to be a basis of justice upon which you make that decision. And here, that basis, that foundation, is the laws of nature and of nature's God, and what the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle human beings. Then thirdly, it's not enough to realize, right, that you are placed within the context of history. It's not enough to realize that there are foundational principles that you must turn to when making decisions. But then a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So there's need of a rhetoric grounded in truth so that the case can be made in a way that persuades others and in which makes the statement that the cause is just and the action is just. So that responsibility, we often don't think about how we're responsible to others within our community. We know we want to fight for our rights. We want to believe that we're wronged, but where do we have responsibility in our communication with others? And here it's very clear, right, that they want to be responsible in this action, which I think is very noble of them.
Yeah, I mean, human beings must give reasons for their actions. This is why things don't stop on July 2nd, because July 2nd, okay, you've now declared the new war aim. The war aim is victory toward independence. And you could stop there and you could work on new government. That makes sense. You could certainly talk about a model treaty and negotiations with France and Spain. So all of that, I get that from the standpoint of the military necessity and establishing new institutions. But there's a moral necessity that leads them as the next act to work on this statement, to get this just right, to say, no, we have to give our reasons. We have to show before God and before man that what we're doing is right, not just that we're capable of doing it, not just that we have the power perhaps to accomplish this. Who knows if we do? We'll have to find out over time. But even if we do, if what we've done is not right, it's not good, right? As human beings, we have to be both capable but also morally justifiable.
Human responsibility to God and man. So, what are the principles? And these are the famous lines that we always remember as we recite the Declaration, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is loaded, right? But can be made simple as well. When you look at another human being, is it self-evident, right, that that other human being is your equal? And I've heard a lot of wise people, say on this point, well, no, it's not self-evident to me. And I actually believe this is common sense that when you look at another human being, you can recognize that other being as participating in what it means to be human. They may look different than you, they may speak a different language than you, but you recognize that the person in front of you is not a cow, is not a spider, is not a bird,
Hmm.
right? But is a human being, right? And I think that simplifies things, but I think that that is self-evident. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matt.
Yeah, it is self-evident. That's right. It's self-evident in two senses. I mean, the classic understanding of self-evident truth is it's tautological, right? In other words, that the predicate is included in the subject. And so when we say human being, an idea of equality is inherent in that notion because we're talking about a certain nature, a common nature that's shared across human beings. But it's also, as you're saying, evident as we observe it. We can see this. And in the Bible, it talks about people being made in the image of God, all human beings being made in the image of God. And so that's capturing something of the essence of what it means to be a human being, but also, therefore, why human beings are equal, regardless of whether they're male or female, or whether they happen to have been born in this country or that country, the color of their skin.
Well, and I remember a conversation about a decade ago with the great advocate for human life, Professor of Jurisprudence Hadley Arcus,
Hmm.
in which we were kind of going through the Declaration and as it applied to the pro-life protections. And I said, when you take a pregnancy test as a female, the pregnancy test is not picking up whether or not there's an elephant in your womb, right, or a spider or a cow, but a human being, right? That pregnancy test is recognizing, right, that the human essence of the thing within you. And you don't take pregnancy tests to figure out kind of what species is growing within you. You kind of know. Does that make sense? So even there,
Yeah,
this proper identification,
right.
right? That within you is an image bearer of God as a human being.
Yeah, and speaking of Haliarchus, 25 years ago now almost, he wrote a book called Natural Rights and the Right to Choose, where he argues it's one or the other. In other words, to justify the right to abortion requires that you deny nature, that you deny the reality of actual human essences. And if you do that, then you lose all your natural rights. So, in other words, there's no way to make an argument, a coherent argument for a right to an abortion. You can assert the privilege of that, the power of that. You can make the case that you want that, but you can't actually establish on the same grounds that we're going to establish a natural right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, any kind of a right to abortion, because it requires you to deny the essential premise of all rights, which is that there is a human nature that we can attach rights to, and that God has deliberately chosen to attach rights to.
Right. Either there is justice, right, or there is advantage of the stronger.
Right.
Either there is nature or there is power. Can't have both.
Choose one. And, this is one of the things I think today we really need to hammer because the reality is on both the right and the left, there's a very disturbing rise in the denial of human equality. I mean, the anti-Semitism that's all over the place, left and right, is gross and right there on the surface. And the right, also has a rise of other kinds of racism. My denomination is the United Reformed Churches in North America, and they put out a statement or approved a statement at their most recent synod meeting just a few weeks ago that condemns without distinction any theological or political teaching which posits a superiority of race or ethnic identity born of immutable human characteristics and calls people to repentance who have held those views or winked at those views. You don't do that unless there's a problem. right? They don't make these statements in the abstract. And by the way, this was joining several other Reformed and Presbyterian denominations who have made recent statements. They also appointed a study committee to look into the issue, the rise of racism and kinism as its sort of sister evil. So this is a rising problem, and I think what's important to understand is that a lot of people who are kind of doing a white nationalism thing think they're standing in the tradition of the founders. But what they're doing is rejecting the fundamental premise that justifies everything the founders argued for in the realm of justice. Human equality, you reject that, you lose the whole thing. That's the first premise in a chain of reasoning that leads to all the rest. So to reject that is to reject the entire founders project. There's no going back there and saying, well, because this was a country that was more predominantly European, then therefore we can impose upon the American founding some notions of white nationalism. That's antithetical to the principles at the core. And so you're not a great patriot if that's the direction you're going. Maybe you would have been great in the CSA, the Confederate States of America. There's other offshoots of the American experience that might suit your sensibilities, but that's not the American founding.
Well, and recognize, and if you want to go in that direction, just recognize that your founding fathers are Darwin and Nietzsche,
Yeah,
not
exactly.
Jefferson, Adams, Washington, and the like.
We'll
So
throw
that,
Calhoun in there too, but yep.
yeah, there you go. But that's your crew. But it's not the crew that you're celebrating on July 4th.
Right.
And it's not the definition of an American nation that would encourage kind of a right nationalism as well. Well, let's get into the second the statement that follows, and this is kind of where it becomes, I think, fairly interesting. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And this is an interesting statement because there had been many governments instituted among men prior to this new institution among the American colonials, and not all governments that were instituted among men were instituted to secure these rights and or recognized that they derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. So here is I think the principle as it ought to be applied, but the fact that it hadn't been applied up until this point. Now, does this undercut their argument at all? And here you get to the question where, well, this has never happened before. How can it be right?
Yeah, and some of them are gonna have an interpretation of the Glorious Revolution that's pretty close to this, as the Parliament essentially gave the crown to William of Orange. There's a little bit, Burke tells a different story to try to hold on to the traditions of the British system, but that's pretty close. That's probably the closest historical analogy here. But you're right. I mean, this is not something that they're talking about. Well, we can just go back and point to a whole series of, for instances, that demonstrate this. And yet, you could say on American soil, there were some roughly analogous situations. I mean, the Mayflower Compact looks kind of like this, and maybe some of those other earlier comings together of colonists. So yeah, this is not a description of history, but this is a description, they're arguing, of the implications that follow from the principle of human equality. No one can stand up and say, you must obey me. No one has the inherent right to command, and
Yeah.
nobody has the inherent necessity of obeying. We're not, we don't have natural masters and slaves. We have natural equals. And so that requires some kind of process whereby people are chosen to lead rather than simply assert their rightful claim to that authority.
And what is so remarkable here is that this has been something that the world has been waiting for, which is a definition of right revolution. When is a revolution right? I mean, you even go back to the beginning of Homer's epic poem, and Achilles is making the case that what has been done to me is wrong. What Agamemnon is asking of me is wrong, and you having a coming together, right, of a group of warriors, but you have that question, of how can this be just, and what do I do about this injustice? And here you have, this statement that, okay, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Do you get that sentiment that this is kind of, I know that Barack Obama used to say that we are what the world has been waiting for, but but in many ways, this is the document that we have been waiting for, right? That humankind has been waiting for thousands of years when it comes to, principles of right governance.
And how do you, yeah, properly justify resistance to that government? Of course, that's a very long-standing and important question in Christian theology. We've talked about before the strong exhortation and command in Paul and in Peter to obey and be submissive to governing authorities. And yet there was the emergence later in the 16th century and beyond of certain theories of resistance, as you saw the horrific persecutions, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and other events like that that got people thinking, okay, wait a second, there must be some limit to the right of government to simply command obedience. And of course, in this situation, part of the context is you've got a foreign power, as they understand it. These people are 3,000 miles away across a distant ocean. And while it was convenient for us to be allied with them, we can put it in those terms, for a time while we were immature and growing and developing as a people, no longer makes sense. And they don't have a common interest with us. We don't have reason to assume that their governance will be in our interest and will be aimed at protecting us and the common good. And so because of that, there's no reason why we should have to continue in this vein. But here's the theory that justifies that, right? So and also this is really the beginnings of the U.S. Constitution. I mean, they're going to invoke this same principle when it comes to setting aside the Articles and replacing it with the Constitution. We need a government that can bring about their safety and happiness. As we talked about last time, this is a critical idea government begins with safety and leads ultimately properly toward happiness.
Yeah, and by this time we're only about a century in to the establishment, and as an embryonic establishment of the nation state, right, as the political form, right, that will try to keep the peace or arrive at a just peace. So we're not long in human history at this point in the whole development of the nation state taking upon itself to do these things. So it's really interesting. I mean, we look at American government as being relatively new along the course of world history. But these developments are a century into the establishment of the nation state. So they're kind of in there at the beginning. Would you
Mhm.
agree with that?
I think that's right. Yeah, that there's different lines of argument and historical development that are all kind of coming together here in 1776.
So how do you decide? How do you decide what proper resistance is? And here, this keyword prudence, that is one of the principles that we've highlighted in our work on what the principles of a republican government ought to be. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. And we've tracked along with this 13-year period
Hmm.
in which there has been, in the language of the Declaration, a long train of abuses and usurpations. And, this will continue throughout the body of the Declaration, in which, Jefferson and others pen what the patient sufferance of the colonies have been, that they have these 18 grievances, all referring to the king, what he has refused to do, what he has forbidden, what he has dissolved, all of these wrongs that have historical context,
Hmm.
and that in the light of the principles of human equality, show that this is a power play rather than a just government. And I think it's important, all right, that they list these grievances, because it it connects the injustice, right, to the cause.
And you might think, oh, what are they sort of taking back the powerful principles that we just cited? Prudence, sounds like what are we afraid of things here? But actually, this is really just a further elaboration of the argument. Because if you take seriously your duty, and it is a duty, as we'll get into maybe later on, to protect your natural rights, you can't just throw away your life over a minor infraction of right. You can't just say, well, I'm willing to hazard all because the British passed one tax I don't like, right? There's got to be a weighing of the risk and reward. And so it may be that you have to put up with for a time certain abuses because the danger of combating those abuses is too great. But at a certain point, when they've accumulated to the degree that they have, and as is documented here in these 18 grievances, then they argue at that point it's right and even necessary for them to resist British authority. There's no reason to think this is going to end any other way other than absolute despotic control over the American colonists. Everything is tending in that direction. And so they have to learn the lesson of those 13 years you were just mentioning and apply it in their context.
It's not a human equality that is self-contained among the colonials. It's a human equality that is deserving of a grievance placed with a king, a grievance placed with a parliament, an appeal made to a British brethren that is likewise under that auspice of human equality. So I think within these petitions and within these grievances is the inherent recognition that the people that you're petitioning to, that you're grieving over, are also your equals.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's essential, right? That we understand that.
Yeah, I mean, they call them our British brethren. And so, even though the whole point of this is to say we're no longer fellow subjects of the king, we're no longer fellow countrymen, nevertheless, there's still that connection, the broader human family. And so, therefore, yeah, we have these responsibilities. And you can go back, and I used to do this in class sometimes, go through those 18 grievances, and you can line them up with violations of the right to life, violations of the right to liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? In other words, what they're doing is just showing, okay, here's how the practice of Britain corresponds to our theory. These are the violations of the exact rights that we're saying government is meant to protect. And what did they do over the course of time? They would petition, they would protest, they would say, look, this law doesn't conform to the English tradition, doesn't conform to right. Would you repeal it? And occasionally they did, but the cumulative effect of the actions of the British Crown and Parliament was such to convince them, again, that there was no reason to believe that this was going to stop. And therefore, they couldn't simply let it go and hope for a better day.
And here, Matt, an interesting segue to current headlines. The Prime Minister of Great Britain will resign, right, today or tomorrow in the next, couple days. The new Prime Minister will be the sixth Prime Minister in 7 years
Hmm.
in Great Britain. What is lacking in Great Britain right now? Exactly what we're talking about in terms of kind of principles of right governance and an appeal to those principles of right governance and to patience, right, to direct back toward foundational principle. That's been lost. It's it's not present at all. So you have no moral anchor, right, other than I don't like the policies, right, of the
Mm.
current parliament. And so you get one revolution after another. And this is a great tragedy, I think, in modern British history, because you've seen this movement within continental Europe, where everything is just a matter of positing one's rights. But it's kind of taken over England as well, to the point that some commentators are saying that England will, in the end, be completely Europeanized. And how much of better outcome for Great Britain, right, had it been warm or welcoming to the Anglo-American tradition of constitutional government that rests in right principle.
Yeah, I remember when Brexit took place, we thought here was a chance. Here was a chance to cement an Atlantic alliance and to really reinforce both there and in the United States that special relationship, right? What a special trade deal, for example, that would have helped Great Britain in those days. And the British left has not wanted that, and the British right has never been, I shouldn't say never, but it hasn't been in the last 30 years conservative in the American sense. It's had different concerns, and the Tory party has not really presented a viable alternative that was grounded in the kinds of principles that we're seeing in these documents, or for that matter, in their own common law tradition, in the great documents of British history. Just hasn't really stood for those things. And so, not really since Thatcher have you had somebody in office that really had a deep sense of that English tradition and was trying to maintain it there and in connection with alliance with the United States.
Yeah, it'll be interesting too. I mean, the next, year or so, Farage will have an opportunity to make a case, but my guess is he's going to make a case more along the lines of continental conservatism than American conservatism for
Right.
which direction England should move forward, which basically leaves you. And listen, I'm a big fan. The only thing holding together English nationalism is the English national football team. That puts
Right.
us in a pretty difficult, puts them in I said us. I mean, I was born in England as were you, but in a difficult political predicament. So we get to the final conclusion here, which is it's very important here to note this. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, appealing to the supreme judge of the world. That's something that's lacking today, right, Matt?
Yeah, and for what? For the rectitude of our intentions. So they're recognizing that God doesn't just judge the action, God judges the intention. And so they're conscious of the need. And we saw this, remember, with Witherspoon's sermon, right? Not don't just jump on a cause that may be just in general terms, but what about your motives for getting into that cause? What about your personal aims? Is that just? And so recognizing that that's all part of the world that God has made is an expectation that people do the right thing for the right reasons in the right way. High bar and no guarantee that we're all going to get over the bar when it comes to that. And certainly in an ultimate sense, none of us are going to get over that bar.
Yeah. And we're going to have to, at the end of the day, we're going to come before a judge, right? And these are the last words. And I think they showcase a certain amount of courage, but a courage grounded in faith, because there's no, they don't have the win under their belt, right? This is still TBD.
Right.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That if this doesn't go right, uh, they'll die. They'll be hung. And I just think that that likewise is missing, right, in our politics today. A pledge of lives, fortunes, and of sacred honor. So
I'm going to stay on these principles, even if it costs me my life, my fortune, because I don't want to lose my honor. And that's unfortunately, we have a lot of pliable politicians and a lot of pliable influencers who are not willing to lose anything in order to stand on a certain principle because they want to follow where the wind's blowing or maybe give a little bit of puff in the right direction. But yeah, this is a very challenging statement, I think, for us and moving when you read it. And you read this document and you imagine the men about to sign it a few weeks later, what they're putting on the line and to recognize all that they were willing to risk on behalf of this project that now 250 years later, we've been so blessed and benefited by.
Yeah, and the one that always comes to mind is John Hancock, who we
Yeah,
kind of still has a bravado to sign as large of a signature as you do, but
yeah,
uh, Hancock's fortune was probably as large as his signature, which tells
right.
you something about what your willingness to to
Yeah,
forgo your fortune over what you think is right. So
right, right. Would Bill Gates or Elon Musk be the first signatory on such a document today?
exactly. Yeah. Good question. So let's turn to the legacy of the Declaration. So we have Jefferson writing almost 50 years later, a famous letter to Henry Lee. What does he say in that letter about what had transpired 50 years prior?
Well, he's trying to sort of go back there and say, well, what was it about? What was the goal of the Declaration of Independence? And of course, he dies on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, as does John Adams. But this is about a year before that. He's writing Henry Lee, one of the famous Lee family of Virginia. And he says it was intended to be an expression of the American mind and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations and letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, like Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. So, in other words, what Jefferson's saying is that this was a statement of the people. This was a statement of the revolutionary sentiment and not meant to be Jefferson or Jefferson on Locke or something of that sort, but rather capturing the essence of what the American people believed as they entered into this phase as an independent people and laid their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line for their cause.
Yeah, I love that line, an expression of the American mind, right? This isn't just
Hmm.
Jefferson, it's an expression of the American mind. And we've seen that, right, over these episodes, right? That this has been the American mind kind of working through these questions of right, justice, et cetera. Well, later on, 1859, April 6th of 1859, Abraham Lincoln writes to Henry L. Pierce, all honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity, along with others, we should say, expression of the American mind,
Hmm.
to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days, it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. So, and we'll see that play out in American history as well. But when looking at the legacy, there have also been critics
Hmm.
of that legacy, and I guess the advocates for it and those who say it didn't go far enough. And this is really the question of any revolution, right? Okay, well, you can have right revolution, but does it actually produce, in Woodrow Wilson's words, progress? So the difference between revolution and progress. Get into that for me, Matt. What's Wilson's issue with the Declaration, and why does he believe that his kind of restatement of what democratic government is in 1912 is the right statement of democratic revolution?
Well, this came from a speech called What is Progress, which was then published 1913, given in 1912 as part of the presidential campaign. So really laying out his vision for what it means to be a progressive Democrat, which is how he would have identified himself in that campaign. And he argues that the founders were bound by the Newtonian world in which they lived. In other words, they believed that there were certain first principles of politics, that you needed to establish institutions that would conform to those first principles. And those first principles were fixed. That what you had discovered in 1776 or 1689 or any previous period was something that could be applied prudently, properly to the problems of any day. And Wilson says they're wrong. Wilson says that politics is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. And what's that mean? It means that politics is about history. Politics is about evolution, is about change. So while they had some interesting ideas for their day, they were bound by their day. They were stuck in the milieu of their time. And now it's 140 years later, and we need something different. We need to revisit our institutions and our ideas, and we need to bring them up to date. And in 100 years, they'll need to be brought up to date again because things continue to change. And so for Wilson, there's no such thing as a self-evident truth that is there for all people at all times. There's only evolving understandings of the way things work that are always subject to new developments and new historical realities.
So what do we end up with this way of thinking? Competing arcs of history. And we see
Right.
this in the left and the right today. If all truth is historical, there is going to be a temptation toward choosing power over nature once again, choosing or asserting one's advantage over recognizing the principles of equal dignity and what we are as image bearers of God. And yeah, and that'll move forward. And I think there are many people with good intentions that want to progress the organism to something better. But if you do so having lost sight that there is such a thing as human nature, that there is such a thing as sin, that there are limitations on politics, you do so in a way that produces more harm than good.
Yeah, this is kind of culminates in a scholarly claim by a famous historian in the 1920s, Carl Becker, who wrote for the day the definitive study of the Declaration of Independence. So not just speaking in broad terms, but sort of giving his understanding of the Declaration. He says, to ask whether the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is true or false is essentially a meaningless question. So by the time it's 1922, pragmatism, progressivism have combined to make implausible the notion that a political theory could be true. There's no such thing as true political theories. There's things that are useful at a given point in time and not useful at a given point in time. But there's nothing that is true as such. And this is really the prevailing view that's underscored the American left ever since, right? Progressivism has adopted different hues and shades over the course of time, but the rejection of foundational, fundamental truth, the rejection of nature, and the elevation of history is essential to progressivism today as much as it was 1922, 1912.
And the big problem with American progressivism, as with other forms of historicism, it always seems that when the have-nots triumph over the haves, they begin to act like the haves again. And this revolution onto replacing one set of haves with another never seems to produce the peace, the culmination that folks like Wilson and Becker were hopeful for. Now, we do have some instances of individuals who I think who rightly understand the Declaration and its meaning. About the Declaration, there's a finality that is exceedingly restful, writes Calvin Coolidge in his 4th of July address in 1926, 100 years ago. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. How about that for silent Cal? I thought it wasn't quite silent. That was pretty powerful. What do you make of that, Matt?
I don't think he chose the word progress there accidentally. Right? There is no progress beyond these self-evident truths. And his argument is, look, the alternative we know about because that was the evil kinds of regimes that the founders were trying to avoid establishing. We know all about governments that deny equality, that deny the consent of the governed, that deny inalienable rights. There's plenty of experience with that. That's not progress. That's regress. And we don't want to go back to that. And rather than do that, Coolidge says, return and rest in those principles of the Declaration of Independence that are still true in 1926 as they were in 1776.
And that does not mean that there's not injustice in the world when Coolidge is writing in
Right.
1926, nor would it mean that there's not injustice in the world in 1963. When Martin Luther King Jr. says, I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, the injustice of any day or tomorrow, I still have a dream. And it's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we have that to turn to as we face injustice in the world, and as we petition against it. And added to that, 50 years ago, President Gerald Ford's bicentennial speech. The Declaration is the Polaris of our political order, the fixed star of freedom. It is impervious to change because it states moral truths that are eternal. And that's really the point that we're making here, Matt, right? That there are moral truths that are eternal, and that for any political community that wants to arrive at a lasting peace in an imperfect world, it has to look to those moral truths as its North Star. And if it doesn't, if it looks at the wrongs that another has done to you, or the right that I have in my correct understanding of things, that just leads to dissolution, to faction, to warfare, and the end of peace. And that's true of nations, it's true of communities, it's true of institutions, it's true of businesses, it's true of families and marriages. And it's a reminder for us, as we move into the celebration of what's going to take place 10 days, 12 days from now, that in any aspect of our life, to turn our gaze to God, to moral truth, to what is right, as we act, albeit imperfectly, and repent, for that imperfect action, that we move forward with such a North Star.
Amen. Well, let's wrap up the show as we always do with de Tocqueville's crystal ball. So last time we thought we'd try our hand at a little World Cup soccer, and we did quite well, actually. So we picked 5 games: Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I got all 5 results right. Didn't get any of the scores exactly right, but had the right winner, or in the case of the Belgium-Iran game, predicted a draw. Overall goal differential of 4, because I was a little high here and low there, or what have you. Dave, you had a great start. First 3 games, you had the winner and the proper goal differential. The last 2 weren't quite so good for you, but overall, still pretty solid. And
Yeah.
so, at least we got a little bit of mojo back.
Yeah, I know. I didn't expect the Dutch to come out and just, give the Swedes a whipping, 5-1.
Yeah.
I thought they were pretty evenly matched teams,
Yeah.
and I thought Belgium would perform better. I think they're still one of the top 8 to 10 teams that could win this thing. I think the thing that I've seen more than anything, and just kind of keeping track of this, I kind of listen to it on Sirius XM on my way back to the Springs each day,
Hmm.
is the emergence of the American national team, and the understanding now that, okay, if they don't make it to the quarters, it's going to be a disappointment. And that we've never thought about that. And I heard one really excellent commentator say that, he thinks that it's within the abilities of the Americans, if they play well at home, to beat every team other than France, Spain, or England, right? That if they played a perfect match, they could beat everyone. But even if they played a perfect match, it'd be pretty hard to beat the English, Spanish, or the French.
Yeah, which puts them on track very much for a quarterfinals type of performance, because we saw the projections where Belgium would be the round of 16 opponent, and Belgium has had 2 draws, hasn't looked super strong, so that's get a home crowd behind you. Why not? And yeah, then you're probably looking at one of those top tier teams in the quarters, if not there, then certainly in the semifinals. So maybe that's as far as the team goes. But yeah, Pochettino is looking very good. There were a lot of doubters, I think, wondering whether he was up for the challenge, or he was focused enough on the challenge, whether he was just trying to play his way back into the Premier League or some other good managerial position. But so far, so good. And it'll be fun to see if the United States can keep it going.
Yeah, I think, the attention of the nation is certainly getting there. I mean, if Joey Chestnut does his job on the 4th of July, I mean,
Yeah.
the added energy to the national soccer team, I mean, it could be off the charts at that point, but he has to play his role.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, our most important prediction of the year, I mean, there are many Tocqueville crystal balls. none more important than the 4th of July, Nathan's hot dog eating contest, and where how many hot dog, I mean, who's going to win? I mean, that's like Joey Chestnut's going to win.
Right.
There's a question of, how many hot dogs does Joey eat? Matt, what are you thinking here? Is this going to be a groundbreaking hot
Well,
dog
what,
eating?
yeah, I mean, went back, reviewed the history again. The record is 76. Obviously, 76 would be a pretty magical number this year. So I think he's going to push himself as hard as he can. I mean, last year he had a great start. He had like 50 in 5 minutes, and then he definitely hit the wall and was slowing down. But can he push himself through? I think he wants the record and he wants the 76. So I'm going for 76 and a half hot dogs, new record, and the semi-quincentennial all wrapped in one.
I don't know if they count quarters. I think you're on the mark. I'm going to go 76 and a quarter. Would a quarter be like half a hot dog or half a roll?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I saw last year's results. They had somebody down with 7/8. So they're willing to do fractional parts for that last hot dog. So
All right.
yeah, one bite, one one roll extra. I don't know how it's going to work, but okay. So we're more or less making the same call. We'll see if he's up for it. It's been a while since he went quite that high into the mid 70s, but Joey, you got to have one more run for America.
America. So, all right. How many does he win by? I'm going to say 20. Uh, it's going to be an amped up, hot dog eating crew. Wins by 20. Closest competitor, 56-ish. How
Okay.
about you, Matt?
Yep, I'm right around where you are. I say 21 and a half. I mean, there's guys who have done 50 that'll be there. Last year there were several guys in the 40s. So no one's Joey Chestnut level, but yeah, I mean, there's people gonna be motivated to give him a run, and that might actually help him if someone can get off to an early good start, push him along. Like they get the rabbits in the marathons, right? And maybe somebody helps him get to 76 and a half by pushing him in those early minutes by cramming a bunch of hot dogs down. So can't wait. Always well, we mentioned the flag cake, but 4th of July can't be 4th of July without hot dogs too.
All good, Matt. Well, I hope you and family enjoy that flag cake. I've heard great things about Pennsylvania pound cake. May have to try to get some of that on our agenda. We'll see. We have some East Coasters coming out for the wedding, but yeah, have a great day. We'll have a wedding the night before, and we'll be out on Lake Pueblo on a pontoon boat celebrating Independence Day. So, but it's been great to kind of go through this history with you, lean upon your study, and hope the listeners have enjoyed this a deeper dive into the Declaration.
Yeah, it's been great and been fun to be along for the ride these last months and weeks. So I hope everyone has a great 4th of July celebration, and we'll have plans for future episodes, but we may take a little break before we get to that. In the meantime, you can reach out to us at Instagram or YouTube. You can email us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com, and we'll look forward to talking to you again.